from the Signature Bank Studios.
If you're looking for the latest news, insight into what it means, and the sharpest opinion, there's only one station in Chicago where you can turn, and it's this one. We're AM 560. The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. The University of Nottingham, across the pond in merry old England, has placed a trigger warning on Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales. Geoffrey Chaucer, 7 centuries later, is being canceled by Western dilettantes. The warning to its Chaucer and his contemporaries module cautions students about, quote, incidents of violence, mental illness, and expressions of Christian faith. Warning about the expression of Christian faith. Got some reaction from other academics to this warning label on Canterbury Tales. Frank Ferruti, who's a sociology professor emeritus at University of Kent, friend of the show, warning students of Chaucer about Christian expressions of faith is weird, since all characters in the stories are immersed in a Christian experience. There's bound to be a lot of expressions of faith. Well, you're probably speaking to people who have not read or perhaps even heard of Chaucer, and they don't really care to hear of or read or think. Or historian Jeremy Black, presumably this Nottingham nonsense is a product of the need to validate courses in accordance with tick box criteria. It is simultaneously sad, funny, and a demeaning of education. By the way, it is worth noting the university's warning label on the Canterbury Tales does not include other explicit themes in the material, such as references to rape and anti-Semitism. No, just Christianity. University spokeswoman defended the decision, saying the institution, say it with me, champions diversity.
Oh, there you go.
For more on this and the real weapon of war, as he wrote about in a piece recently, we're pleased to be joined by Daniel Mahoney, who is professor of politics at Assumption College and author of The Statesman as Thinker, Portraits of Greatness, Courage, and Moderation. I wonder if we have any recent contributions to that profile. Professor Mahoney, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Oh, my great pleasure. Thank you.
We've got to make sure the kids are not scared away from Chaucer.
Well, you know, it's Roger Scruton, great English philosopher, political philosopher, started speaking in the 70s and early 80s about something called the culture of repudiation, that more and more in elite intellectual circles, activist circles, education, at almost every level, beginning at the university level, but then going down to elementary education, was dedicated to a self-conscious project of repudiating the Western inheritance, tradition of common sense, rooted in faith and reason, et cetera, et cetera. And I think this is just the byproduct of that in a truly silly but also pernicious way. So this is what we're confronted with, is a kind of deliberate effort to say that everything that was held near and dear by our forebears, everything at the root of our civilized inheritance has to be somehow uprooted. And I would just add, George Orwell wrote an essay in 1940 called The Lion and the Unicorn about the need for firm resistance to totalitarianism. And he said about the English people then, they were not the most religious people on earth, but he said they still were Christians in their heart. They still held on to a old-fashioned notion of right and wrong, and he said they could never be taken in by the sophistries and cruelties of communism or Nazism. Well, that's not so true anymore.
Well,
yeah, and
sorry for interrupting, but why wait until now to put a trigger warning on his works, on Canterbury Tales?
Well,
they've had centuries.
Sure, but even during the European Enlightenment, where you certainly had many philosophers and intellectuals who were anti-Christian. Voltaire famously said, we have to écraser la femme, crush the infamy being the Christian religion. Those attitudes never really took root outside a small coterie of philosophers and intellectuals. But what's happened now is that this anti-Christian ideology, this idea that the West is a uniquely guilty and terrible civilization, this has been institutionalized. There's so many people with, advanced degrees in sociology and psychology and these kinds of things, that the intellectual class is much larger, it's cruder, and it really identifies progress with an assault on the West, and the West is at its heart, at least in good part, a Christian, a biblical. So I think they're just catching up, and but the root of it, I think, is real self-loathing. The idea that of all the cultures and civilizations in the history of humanity, the Western world has a kind of monopoly on perfidy, a monopoly on evil, and I would guess that somebody like Chaucer, who was an essential part of English national literature, was for a long time just too central, like Shakespeare, to the English tradition to be publicly assaulted like this. But now I think anything goes.
Yeah, clearly. Shakespeare met his demise. It was not greatly exaggerated in a lot of English departments around the country. We've been talking about that for years now. So I guess this shouldn't come as a surprise. The approach, though, of those who are totalitarian drones projecting who they are onto others as sort of the artifice to advance their cause.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And by the way, if they succeed, they really succeed in depriving new generations, including young people, of any contact with the best that's been thought and said. I know at the college I taught at for many, many years, 36 years, the English department refused to offer a course on Shakespeare. And at one point, I told the president of the college, who was constantly approaching our English department about teaching such a course, that you're almost better off not having them teach a course, because they're simply going to approach Shakespeare as an author to be indicted. Racist, sexist, homophobic, dominated by evil class categories, etc. So, I think your term totalitarian drone is about right. It's all so predictable.
Well, and so, but you mentioned Paul Hollander, I think, in your piece about this, about woke language as a weapon of war. I mean, in terms of the history repeating itself, or at least rhyming, the Western intellectuals that you were just talking about, how they throw in with the totalitarians who are more than just totalitarian philosophically, they're doers. And if we see the same sorts of things occurring today.
Yeah, one point I make in my piece is that I think what's central to all these ideological projects, and by that we mean essentially totalitarian projects, is the key question is no longer what's true and what's false, what's in accord with human nature, what allows a people or culture to flourish. The key issue becomes, are you in accord with the movement of history? Are you with progress? And if you're not with progress, you're a reactionary. So the old distinction between what's true and false, good and evil, gets replaced by progress versus reaction. And what these people mean by progress and what they mean by democracy is a kind of systematic rejection of everything that came before. And that's the culture of repudiation I referred to. And so that's an inherently tyrannical project. So people can talk about progress, they can talk about democracy, but in effect, they want to redefine the meaning of language in a way that anyone who defends what George Orwell called intellectual and linguistic hygiene, the real meaning of words, by definition, when you defend, the clarity of language, when you defend the traditional modes of talking about the human person and civilization, you're on the wrong side of history, and there's no place for you in the curriculum. So, and I would insist this is not so marginal. You know, with this settler colonialism stuff we're seeing all around us, I mean, young people are motivated increasingly by this idea that, the United States, Canada, Australia, Israel have a monopoly on evil. And, you're in trouble talking about the corruption of language when the default position on the academic and activist left is Israel best compared to apartheid South Africa or Nazi Germany,
Right. Well, but that's just it, right? So they need their own, as you're describing, their own vocabulary to justify the introduction of a new lexicon or the redefinition of existing words to mean something very different. But I mean, at the core of it, this is, I mean, it seems to be another movement that is led by intellectuals, fueled by useful idiots, and with a few ideologues in between that really mean business.
Yeah. You mentioned Paul Hollander, the great sociologist of totalitarianism, was a good friend of mine. He made the point that these intellectuals and activists were most attracted to communist regimes when they were the most murderous. Nobody was particularly excited about, Brezhnev's Soviet Union because it was cold and bureaucratic. But Lenin and Stalin murdered with impunity, or the excitement about Che Guevara, or the excitement about the Viet Cong and Ho Chi Minh and this kind of thing. Yeah, and I think what goes hand in hand with this, too, is such a manipulation of language that, people start using what I call homonyms, words like peace and equality and equity, diversity, inclusion, take on a radically new meaning. And yes, there are the totalitarians and the totalitarian drones, but then there are the sort of soft liberals and leftists who don't quite realize that they've adopted a language at odds with many things they care about, and that process has been going on for a couple of centuries now with totalitarianism, but we see the same structure, so to speak, in the manipulation of language with the woke, or the weaponization of language, as we said before.
Well, you see it too when you see some people, men and women of the left, break from the left over certain events or incidents, like, for example, Bill Ackman, the billionaire financier, did after the pro-Hamas protests at Harvard. Famously announced he's not donating any more money, as did a couple of others. But then he has gone further and further to the point now where just this week he released on Twitter or something 33 reasons why he used to explain to his friends, all liberal or left, why he's voting for Trump and not Kamala Harris, which is a break from his previous political behavior. So it's always instructive to see those who defect as well, sort of like, like a communist defector. Those who defect.
Bill Ackman's an interesting case because he drew larger conclusion, as you said. I read that manifesto with his 33 reasons. It was quite well done and quite compelling, I think. But a lot of people don't get it. They see the particular problem at hand, but they don't connect it to a larger syndrome, a larger mode of thinking that's destructive of the things they ultimately care about. And so that's a real problem, I think. And one has to ask, and by the way, I welcome Bill Ackman's seeing of the light, so to speak, but it does make me wonder why so many people took so long to acknowledge trends that had been, institutionalized on college campuses for a very, very long time. But maybe they needed that direct moment where everything became obvious to them. But these are not new trends at all. I mean, most of them were crystallized in the 80s and 90s and have just gotten worse in recent decades. So,
well, that therein lies the problem. We're a lot further along, further down the road to serfdom than some people would otherwise appreciate. Professor Daniel Mahoney, professor of politics at Assumption College, author of The Statesman as Thinker, Portraits of Greatness, Courage, and Moderation. Professor Mahoney, thank you as always.
Well, thank you, Dan. You have a great day.
You too, and he joined us on our turnkey.pro answered line.
Connect with Dan and Amy using the AM560 mobile app. Download it today at 560theanswer.com/mobile.
Hey, Chris. How was your week?
Oh, sorry, Jen. I can't talk right now. The network is down again, and I can't access any of my files. What's worse, I'm late for a virtual call and past deadline on a project.
Let me help. I'll reboot the cable modem, wait 10 minutes, then reboot the router. Let's see if that works.
Sounds easy enough, but I shouldn't have to play resident IT director every time our equipment goes down. I shouldn't be messing with this IT work.
I agree. This technical stuff is stressing me out, and I'm tired of getting blamed by the boss for all of these outages.
We gotta convince the boss man to find a company to help us. This is just not working.
At Turnkey, we understand the importance of having a network you can count on, one that's reliable and doesn't go down. We provide quick, friendly service when things go wrong with no hidden fees for on-site support. Turnkey is the small business champion, delivering world-class service at the price of a monthly car payment. Visit turnkey.pro. That's turnkey.pro.
Are you turning 65 and thinking about Medicare?